Welcome to the Native American Language, otherwise known as the NAL ED 2022 Grant Competition webinar. This is guidance for prospective applicants. We're going to get started today with our standard disclaimer.
Oh, shucks. Sorry.
And I can just read that.
Yeah, sorry, it's not playing.
No worries. This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. And now that you are fully disclaimed, I want to cover just a few logistic pieces for the day. So everyone is going to be muted for this webinar just in the interest of time. However, we do want your questions. So if you have any questions as we're going throughout our time together, please post those in the chat box and then we'll periodically be stopping to answer those. But don't wait for us to stop. Pop them in as they occur so that we can get to them as quickly as possible. If you're not sure where to find the chat, typically it's at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little talk bubble. And if you click on that, it will open a chat box for you where you can post those questions. If you're on a mobile device, often you're going to have to page over from right to left. And please note that none of us are able to respond to private messages due to this being a competitive grant competition. Now, we will also be posting this webinar, both the slide deck and the recording on the OIE web page. We'll post a link to that in the chat box as well so that you can access that. That will be up by end of day Friday. And if you have any technical issues as we go through today, you're welcome to reach out to me in the chat. Or if for some reason you get connected, please email us at oie@seiservices.com and we'll get you reconnected. Today, we're joined by Dr. Donna Sabas-Burns, the OIE Discretionary Group Leader and the NAL ED Competition Manager, as well as Angela Hernandez, the Professional Development Program Officer. And I'll go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Donna Sabas-Burns.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much for everybody joining us today for the webinar. As Sarah mentioned, we do have a lot of material to cover. This is the second of 2 pre-application webinars for this program, and they're meant to help applicants understand exactly what you're applying for this competition and what it all involves. They're both the same. One is not a substitute. So if you didn't get the first one, or you're trying the second one for something different, they're both exactly the same. There are some in the application package, in the notice of inviting applications, if you happen to have those handy, it'd be nice to bring them up and go over it with you as we go through our slides. We strongly encourage you to read both documents entirely, and you'll probably hear us say that a million times. There will be time for questions and answers, as Sarah said, during the webinar, but you don't have to wait until then. If you have questions, just pop them in the chat and we will take care of you. And so with that, we shall get started. And here are the items that we will be covering. We'll be taking a look at the objectives and who's joining us today. We'll be looking at the purpose of the competition overview, the priorities, looking at the application requirements and the program requirements and the selection criteria. We'll also take a look at the grant budget information and guidance. We'll take a look at some application package and instructions, and post-applications transmittal and some other resources. So a full plate. So thank you again for being here. And hopefully when you get done, as we said, you will walk away with a keen understanding of everything involved in this competition and how to apply to it. Please ask questions as needed. And we think that you should be well informed by the time you get done. So let's get started to the next slide, please.
So as we get started today, we would really like to know a little bit more information about all of you. So I'm going to be launching a poll. It should pop up on your screen. But again, if you're on a mobile device, you may need to thumb over to the actual poll, just asking what type of eligible entity are you representing today? Are you representing an Indian tribe, a school operated by the Bureau of Indian Education, the BIE, a tribal college or university, a TCU, an Alaska Native Regional Corporation, a tribal education agency, a TEA, a private tribal or Alaska Native nonprofit organization, a local educational agency, an LEA, and that could include a public charter school that's an LEA under your state's law. Are you a non-tribal for-profit organization? Or do none of those really describe you? Select none of the above, and then let us know over in the chat box what type of entity you are. Give everyone just a few seconds to respond here. Y'all are quick. I can tell y'all are Zoom pros because we've already got 80% of you responded. Good job. All right, so it looks like we have about 33% of you representing an Indian tribe, followed by 16% representing a BIE school. And I'll share this so that you can see it as well. Oh, and about 27% LEAs. So those are our top 3 today, with a few kind of scattered throughout the others as well. I do see 3 of you that were none of the above. So feel free. I see some of you popping over on the side that you're a state education agency, or you're an LEA and a county office of ed. So I think there's one more of you out there to respond in the chat. And then we'll keep going. We do have one other poll regarding just a little bit of information that we'd love to know. So as we go to the next slide, I'll launch that next poll, asking, how did you find out about this competition? We always want to make sure that information is getting out to the field when we have these new grant opportunities. So it's really helpful for us to know, how did you find out about this? Did you see it on the OIE website? Did you see it through our listserv? Maybe you're part of our listserv. Maybe on the Department of Ed grants forecast or the Federal Register. Potentially a current grantee sent you the info, or maybe you are a current grantee. And then similar to the other, if there was some other way you found out about this, mark other in the poll, but let us know over in the chat box how it was you found out about the competition. Super helpful for us. Thank you. I see some of you sharing there the different ways that you found out about this grant competition. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up that poll. It looks like the majority of us are on that OIE listserv, which is super helpful, a great way to stay in the know with what's going on with the Office of Indian Ed. But it also looks like quite a few of us found out other ways, all kinds of email forwards and people who sent us the info, followed by, looks like the next is kind of a tie between that Department of Ed grants forecast and the website. All great ways to stay in the loop. So I appreciate you taking the time to respond to those polls for us. And now we'll jump into more of the content. Oh, Donna, you're muted.
Yes, I am. Thank you. For $1 every time that's happened. This webinar represents a portion of the required information that's available out there. And so we really want to emphasize this is not 100% comprehensive. So don't rely on every single piece of information that's going to come to you comes from here. So we say, please, please, please read the NIA and the application package often, and read it a lot. And share the reading and everything you can, because it's that's where all your answers are going to be. So if we don't hit it here, you can always go back there and get the information from those items. And remember to follow the instructions on the www.grants.gov and all the registration processes, such as the UEI and SAM requirements. Those are all part of the application process and very easily can deter you from getting in and getting your application submitted. So very important pieces all around. So next slide. Looking at the purpose and eligibility and funding overview is what I will be talking about for the next few slides. A lot of this information comes from the ESCA and the Notice of Final Priorities here. And here's the program authority that gives the NAL, Native American Language Program Ed, the authority to fund this program. So there's a link, and of course you'll have the access to all the slide decks, and you'll be able to link this as needed. But there's the program authority, which umbrellas everything about this program. And the purpose of NAL. So the purpose of the Native American language is to truly support schools that use Native American and Alaska Native languages as the primary language of instruction. We want you to, in hopes that you can maintain, protect, and promote the rights and freedoms of Native American and Alaska Natives to use, practice, maintain, and revitalize the languages as envisioned in the Native American Language Acts of 1990, and support the nation's First Peoples' efforts to maintain and revitalize these languages and cultures, and hopefully as a result improve educational opportunities and student outcomes with the Native American and Alaska Native communities. Next slide, there we go. Eligibility. So this is a big one. There's a lot of questions are asked about eligibility. And here are the eligible entities. We have the Indian tribe. We have a tribal college or university, a TCU, tribal education agency, or otherwise known as a TEA, the local educational agency, and this does include public charter schools that are an LEA under state law. We have a BIE operated school. We have an Alaska Native Regional Corporation available, listed in this regulation here. A private tribal or Alaska Native nonprofit organization, as well as a non-tribal for-profit organization as an eligible entity for this program. Next slide. And looking at kind of the overall funding piece, these were funds that were appropriated unexpectedly, so it's a great opportunity that we can provide this to you. It is a little bit over $1 million, and when we average the amounts per year, around 300,000 to 400,000, we should fund about 3 for this program. One change for those who are familiar with our NAL program. Previously, we have a 3-year program. This particular grant is offering up to 5 years, 16 months of funding opportunity. So that's a great change in opportunity for you to extend those learning years beyond the 3 that we have given previously. The notice of intent to apply is coming up very soon. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And of course, the most important date is the application deadline, which is at 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, August 2nd. Please make sure that is on your calendar. And right now I'm going to turn it over to Angela to take the next couple slides.
Thanks, Donna. I had to be unmuted. Give me 1 second. Welcome, everybody. The notice of intent to apply is encouraged and it's not required. This really helps us in planning for the grant competition just by ensuring we have the adequate number of peer reviewers. However, with respect to any of the benefit it brings to you, it's one, the opportunity to also learn and share what potential entities as well as Native American languages are being proposed for prospective applications, meaning that we take this information and we will post entities who have indicated an intent to apply and where they have indicated a Native American language to go ahead and also provide us with that Native American language being proposed for the project, so that you have the opportunity to see, and we're going to talk about why that's important, to see what other potential entities might be applying from the same state or to proposing the same language that you are. Next week is the deadline, but I will say if you turn it in later, that's fine too. And if you decide that you are not going to apply, that's also okay. There's no penalty. This is all voluntary. Next slide. So why is it important to know exactly why and what language folks are proposing and where they are located? There are a couple of requirements that really are actually requirements that the department must follow, but that you should be aware of for each competition. This is statutory, so it's required by law. We have to ensure that a diversity of languages are in place, and therefore we will not fund more than one project in any competition year that proposes to use the same Native American language, assuming there are enough high quality applications. In the event of a lack of high quality applications in one competition year, the department may choose to fund more than one project with the same Native American language. Similarly, geographic distribution is important. So to ensure geographic diversity, assuming there are enough high quality applications, the department will not exclusively fund projects that all propose to serve students in the same state in any competition year. And in the event of a lack of high quality applications, again, we may choose to fund only applications that propose to provide services in one state. So it certainly is something that for the last two competition rounds, we have been able to adhere to. As an FYI, let's go to the next slide. And on the next slide, you can see here our FY18 and FY20 grantees. We had more FY18 grantees. This is a list of really a visual of who's active currently. But this gives you a sense of what languages are being are used right now in the existing projects and where they are located. To be clear, if you see your state as one of those states where they are now, that's fine, because again, these are for different competition years. So you can be from Montana or from Minnesota or South Dakota, et cetera, or New Mexico, and that's not an issue for this competition year. It's really about other applicants who may be applying from the same state and or proposing the same language. Next slide. And I'll turn it back to you, Donna.
Great, thank you. Okay, this next section will be talking about the priorities, both the competitive preference priorities and the absolute priorities to which you must write to when you submit your application. Next slide. So when we talk about absolute priorities for this particular competition and any subsequent year in which we make awards, from the list of unfunded application from this competition, these priorities are called absolute priorities. And under the 34 CFR 75.105C3, we consider only applications that meet either absolute priority 1 or absolute priority 2, either or. And we'll get into a little bit more about what those priorities are next. Absolute priority 1 is to develop and maintain new Native American language programs. And to meet this particular priority, an applicant must propose to develop and maintain a Native American language instructional program that will support the Native American language education and development for Native American students, as well as provide professional development for the teachers and, as may needed, staff and administration to strengthen the overall language and academic goals of the school or the schools that will be served by this project. Absolute priority 1 must take place in a school, and it doesn't augment or replace a program of identical scope that was active within the last 3 years of the school to be served. And just as a side note, you'll probably hear this a couple of times, that when you apply, you must clearly identify the specific absolutely priority that the proposed project addresses in the project abstract. So I just want to make that sure that's clear up front. You must mention which absolute priority you are applying to. The second priority is to expand and improve existing Native American language programs. And to meet this priority, an applicant must propose to improve and expand a Native American language instructional program that will improve and expand Native American language education and development for Native American students, as well as provide professional development for teachers, and again, as appropriate, staff and administration to strengthen the overall language and academic goals of the school or schools to be served. And also, this will take place in a school, and also within the past 3 years have been offered at the school to be served. Slide.
So a frequently asked question is when applicants are trying to figure out which one should I choose to apply. So in the first example, an applicant that was proposing a new Navajo program for 8th graders in a school that had no language program for any students since 2019 or earlier would apply under absolute priority 1 as a new program. Example 2, an applicant that was proposing a new Navajo language program for 5th graders at a school where the program already exists and it currently exists for 1st through 4th graders, they would apply under absolute priority 2 to expand, just as Donna has shared in the previous slides. Next slide. Moving on to competitive preference priorities, we award up to an additional 7 points to an application, depending on how well an application meets competitive preference priority 1, and we award up an additional 5 points to an application that meets competitive preference priority 2. As we walk through many parts of the application and program requirements and optional items like competitive preference priorities, we're going to be making an effort to highlight how and where eligible entities should address these items in their applications. Next slide. So starting with competitive preference priority 1, to meet this priority, an applicant or a partner must receive or be eligible to receive a formula grant under Title VI of the ESEA and must commit to use all or part of that formula grant funding to help sustain this project after the conclusion of the grant period. To meet this priority, an applicant must include in its application a statement that indicates the school year in which the entity will begin using Title VI formula grant funds. Next slide. They must also indicate the percentage of the Title VI grant that will be used for the project. So a minimum of 20% of the Title VI funding, and that's for 3 points. And you see it scaled and scaffolded up to 100% for the full 7 points. And then C, they must also include a timeline for obtaining parent committee input and approval of this action if necessary. Where do you do this? You'll indicate and complete this information if you are applying for consideration for CPP1 in an attachment. This is a standard form that's in the application instructions package that you can access via grants.gov. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. Next slide. Competitive preference priority 2. This is a yes or no answer, and it's a preference for Indian applicants. So it's 0 points or 5 points. And again, to meet this priority, an application must be submitted by an Indian tribe, Indian organization, Bureau of Indian Education, BIE funded school, or tribal college or university that is eligible to participate in the NAL ED program. And just to be clear, when we talk about a consortium, it's a consortium of eligible entities must meet the EDGAR requirements, 75.127 through 75.129, and it must include an Indian tribe, Indian organization, BIE funded school, or TCU, or tribal college or university. They'll also be considered eligible in order to meet this priority. Next slide, please. And again, in order to be considered a consortium application, the application must include the agreement signed by all parties. And the agreement must include at a minimum, it must designate one member of the group to apply for the grant, detail the activities that each member of the group plans to perform, and bind each member of the group to every statement and assurance made by the applicant in the application. Next slide. I'm going to just whiz past this for now, Donna, but I don't know if there are any questions that we can answer quickly here. I'll defer to you if you've been watching, and if not, we can move on to the next section.
Yeah, there are just a couple of questions.
Okay.
Does all programming undertaken by the grant have to take place in a school? They have needs to develop dictionaries and curriculum that will require community programs.
The purpose is to support school-based instruction of the language. Okay.
Is a
Next.
nonprofit private school eligible?
I'll ask that any eligibility questions about your status and whether you feel you fit or don't fit in the eligible entities listed, that you send the question to nal@ed.gov.
Great.
And it would help if you indicate, for example, for tax purposes, what do you identify yourself as? Is it, for example, a nonprofit, a 501c3? Are you a for-profit in your tax filings?
There was a question about clarifying the statements about being in the same state.
In any given competition year, so for this fiscal year competition, we will take and we'll go, I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't have the slide in front of me. Basically, we are looking to not fund more than one applicant per state and or per language, consistent with the statute that asks for diversity of languages as well as geographic distribution. And again, this is all pending on the basis of receipt of an adequate number of high quality applications to fund. And in the event we don't have adequate numbers of high quality applications, we may choose to fund, for example, more than one application that proposes to a project for the same language, and or one or more applications that proposes to hold the project in the same state.
Next question, as a residential school, if they offer the program through their after school program, would it still be considered an in-school program for priority 1?
If it's at the school and it's supporting school students at that school, yes. And we'll go through the general requirements. So it's almost as though you're kind of backtracking. If you look at the general requirements and what's expected of you as far as what you have to report and the reporting requirements, if you don't have those entities in place, you're not going to be able to fulfill the program requirements. So again, I understand there might be some different iterations or formats or approaches to the language instruction. In general, the goal is to move toward full immersion, and it's with the expectation that you're working toward that. However, again, there's an absolute priority 1 that is really about focus on new programs, which we would expect would not go full tilt, right? Not be wall to wall in year 1, but it need to be scaffolded and built over time. And we would expect probably more robust programming from applicants that have existing programs and are looking to expand.
And then what
we
if
can
they
probably
are,
answer, Sarah, I'm just going to mention, we'll also get to that through the selection criteria. Let's take one more question, then we should probably move.
Yep. If they are an existing language program, but they want to add a new language.
If there's an existing program, they're expanding the existing program.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. We'll save any other questions for our next question section. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Donna?
Yes, thank you. All right, for this next section, we'll be talking about some general requirements, the memorandum of agreement and so forth, and certification. Next slide, please. And then this is a good time if you do have those applications and NIA beside you, you can follow along if you can. Many application requirements are addressed by completing specific forms and adding attachments to the application package. And so you're going to see something called Part 6 of the other attachments of the application package. There's a lot of components to this, so we're presenting this first. And Part 6 with other, so you'll see many different requirements that you will need to complete and answer as part of your general requirements to submit with the application, okay? And here, yeah, there you go. Sorry, just lost my place. So looking at the required of all applicants, here's a box of applicant information with assurances, and you'll have a lot of assurances to sign off on. And this is looking at application requirements 1, general requirements. So this document also contains the program assurances as part of that Part 6 to be signed. And here's an important part: to be signed by the authorized representative of the applicant. There's 2 different people that normally are found in the application. It's the person who's putting the application together and signs, perhaps potential project director, and then the authorized representative signing off on that, 2 separate signatures. Next slide. Okay, to meet the general requirements, you must complete the form, and it's entitled Attachment Applicant Information for NAL ED Program and Assurances, very clearly labeled. And this talks about that instructional language piece. The name of the Native American or Alaska Native language to be used for instruction at the school supported by that eligible entity needs to be listed here clearly. And we want you to also include the number of students to be served by the project, and also which grade levels of targeted students in the proposed project. Looking at instructional hours, the number of hours of instruction per week and through 1 or more of the Native American and Alaska Native languages currently be provided to targeted students at such school, if any. There's also a pre and post assessment piece, and whether a pre or post assessment of Native American language proficiency is available, and if not, the percentage of grant funds that will be used for developing such assessment. And of course, a program description, a description of how the eligible entity will support the Native American language education and development, and also provide that professional development for staff in order to strengthen the overall language and academic goals of the schools that will be served by the project. We also look to ensure that the implementation of rigorous academic content that prepares all students in college and career readiness, and also ensure that students progress towards meeting high-level fluency goals in said Native American language. Also in the requirements are organizational information. So for each school included in the project, information regarding the school's organizational governance or affiliations, and specifically we're looking for information about the school's governing entity. So if you're an LEA or a tribal education agency or charter school, private org or other governing entity, and please include this information, the school's accreditation status, and any partnerships with institutions of higher eds, and any indigenous language schooling and research cooperatives can be included as well. Okay, when we look at general requirements for an assurance, the assurance is the authorizing representative for the applicant must sign the form provided in Part 6. And I say that intently because we really need you to abide and make sure these pieces are signed. Without the requirement in the app, it could cause eligibility issues with your application. So please make sure that you are adhering to these requirements. Looking at the assurances, taking a look at the school is engaged in meeting state or tribally designated long-term goals for students, as may be required by applicable federal, state, or tribal law. The school provides assessments of students using the Native American or Alaska Native language of instruction where it's possible. Looking at the qualifications of all instructional and leadership personnel at the school are sufficient enough to deliver the high quality education that we're seeking through the Native American or Alaska Native language at the school. And number 4, the school will collect and report to the public data relative to student achievement and, if appropriate, rates of high school graduation, career readiness, and enrollment in post-secondary education or workforce development programs of students who are enrolled in this program. Number 2, as we phase out of the next piece and into this, the Memorandum of Agreement, conditional. Any applicant that proposes to work with a partner to carry out the proposed project must include a signed and dated Memorandum of Agreement that describes the roles and responsibilities of each partner who will be participating in the grant. We're looking for a description of how each partner will implement the project according to the timelines described in the application, roles and responsibility of each partner related to ensuring the data necessary to report on the Government Performance and Results Act, otherwise referred to as GPRA indicators. And of course, the roles and responsibilities of each partner related to ensuring that the Native American language instructors, they can be properly recruited, retained, and trained as appropriately and a timely manner as indicated in your application. This Memorandum of Agreement must be signed within 4 months prior to the application deadline. And I do want to underscore that several times when reviewing screening applications, this piece is, you may pull in an old MOA from a prior grant or something. It's very important that you provide a current signed MOA with the designated roles and descriptions within that memorandum. I do want to underscore the importance with a non-LEA entity having an MOA that requires the district or BIE school to share their data for grant reporting purposes. So make sure there is a data collection agreement, some forth. The MOA should also document that has been signed within 4 months, of course, of the deadline again. So we're looking what, August 4th, doing the math. August 2nd, it would be April 2nd. Nothing before April 2nd, if my math is right. All right, next slide. Okay, looking at application requirement number 3, this is where the applicant engagement with tribal Indian tribes and tribal organizations. All non-tribal applicants, you must engage with the appropriate officials from tribes located in the area served by the project or with a local tribal organization prior to submission of an application. The engagement must provide for the opportunity for officials from tribes or tribal organizations to provide meaningful and substantively contributions and input to the application. Non-tribal applicants must submit evidence of either this tribal engagement or a letter of support from one or more of the tribes or tribal organizations included in the application. And this evidence can be part of the Memorandum of Agreement required by application 2 that we just discussed, and can be uploaded as a separate attachment. And there's a little note here, if an applicant is an affected LEA that is subject to ESSA, this particular section 8538, then the LEA is required to consult with appropriate officials from tribes or tribal organizations approved by the tribes located in that area served by the LEA prior to submission of the application. Tribal certification. We're looking at the applicant that is an LEA, and this does include the public charter schools that is an LEA under state law. a school operated by the BIE or a non-tribal for-profit or nonprofit organization, you must submit a certification from an entity described in application requirement 4A. And is containing the assurances described in application requirement 4B. Now, the certification must be from one of the following entities on whose land the school or program is located, or that an entity served by the school or whose members as defined by that entity are served by the schools. And these following entities are a federally recognized Indian tribe or tribal organization, a TCU, Alaska Native Regional Corporation or Alaska Native Nonprofit Organization, and this also includes a Native Hawaiian organization. The certification, you must state that the school or applicant organization actually has the capacity to provide education primarily through a Native American or Alaska Native language. And also that there's a sufficient number of speakers of the target language at the school or available to be hired by the school or applicants. It's very important with recruitment. If you don't have that planned out, you might have some problem funding your program if you don't have the proper recruitment and personnel in line. And this is an example of what that form looks like. So please make sure that you're checking all those boxes. All of this information was just presented to you. So hopefully it will make sense when you actually see it in person, but please fill it out in its fullest when submitting your application.
Thanks, Donna. Donna's just gone through a whole litany of forms that you're going to be required to submit or encouraged to submit depending on the type of entity you are. We are going to come back and walk through very explicitly what you turn in depending on who you are, meaning depending on which eligible entity is the lead applicant. Just very quick before I move on to program requirements, I'm going to answer a couple of questions. Helen, thank you for your question about when will funding be allocated. This is FY 2022 funds appropriated by Congress, and therefore we are required to award no later than September 30 of this year. So you should be preparing an application that supports implementation beginning no later than October 1 of this year. Okay. Second, Lindsay, you asked a good question about who's considered a partner, and you said we're looking to include guest language speakers. I think a really big question is turning it back to you and saying, you know, a consortium agreement is really talking about a full partnership in carrying out the requirements of the grant versus a programmatic activity that might be, for example, contracted. So again, that's up to you to kind of determine the scope and scale of involvement and expectation from the entities that you might be working with. And then Cheryl, we will get to the signatures, and our overview might help you answer your question about who needs to be signing what. Switching gears now to program requirements. These requirements apply to grantees. So if you get the award, we just ask that for you as applicants, you keep them in mind when you're developing your applications. You won't be disqualified if you don't address these in your applications, but you should know that you would be expected to carry these things out. Next slide, please. So we expect that grantees, applicants that are awarded, will carry out administering pre and post assessments of Native American language proficiency to participating students. This Native American language assessment may be any relevant tool that measures student Native American language proficiency, such as, and this is not comprehensive or exhaustive, oral, written, or project-based assessments, informative or summative assessments. Next slide. We thought we would share, based on what our existing grantees already do, for the purposes of giving you a better sense of what we expect are ambitious but reasonable approaches to native language proficiency assessment. So some types of assessment that we see are conversational assessment with a proficient educator or assessor, a conversational and question-based assessment with elder of same gender, an online multiple choice and spoken assessment, or an online assessment where student records their verbal responses to written and or audio prompts. Again, these are not exhaustive. These are meant simply to give you a backdrop and an understanding of what has been supported by existing grantees. If you have existing items that are more robust, or you have a whole other direction you want to go, the expectation is that you're proposing that project in that approach with detail in your narrative. Means of determining proficiency. So again, you might identify grade and or age level appropriateness for proficiency, the same scale for everybody, including adults, or an adapted version of an ACTFL scale. So again, there's a lot of variability in how this can be delivered. The expectation is that you are the experts. You are the educators, and you are the ones proposing a sound, ambitious, but reasonable project. Next slide. Of course, we have the ISDEAA statutory hiring preference. So awards that are primarily, such as those that OIE disseminates, are expected to be subject to the provisions of Section 7B of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. So that's where we ask you, to the extent possible, to give to Indians preferences and opportunities for training and employment in connection with the administration of the grant, and give to Indian organizations and to Indian-owned economic enterprises preference in the award of contracts in connection with the administration of the grant. And again, for the purposes of this section, an Indian is a member of any federally recognized Indian tribe. Next slide. So we also have, of course, the performance measures as required by any federal education discretionary grant program. The GPRA measures, as we call them, are the department's indicators of success of the program. Applicants are advised to carefully consider the measures that I'll share in a moment in conceptualizing your approach to an evaluation for this proposed project. Grantees will be required to provide in their annual performance and final performance reports data about its progress in meeting these measures. So consequently, again, we really ask you to think about the data that you're proposing or the types of measures, and making sure that they, in fact, are data elements that you can collect and will not have trouble reporting annually. Next slide. So here are the measures. There are 4 measures. One is the number and percentage of participating students who attain proficiency in a native language, again, as determined by those required pre or post session assessments. The number and percentage of participating students who make progress in learning a native language as determined by each grantee through pre and post session assessments of native language proficiency. Measure 3, the number and percentage of participating students who show an improvement in academic outcomes as measured by academic assessments or other indicators. I want to underscore, is measured by academic assessments or other indicators, meaning we are not looking, as many other discretionary grant programs of the department typically prescribe, you looking to the state academic proficiency in math or reading. This does not. This allows you to identify, maybe it's a district formative assessment, district-wide, or maybe it's something that the state does that, again, is summative, but not the state proficiency exam. Whatever it is, you have the discretion to identify what that measure is. It's just key that you are able to access the data that allows you to report both the numbers and the percentages of the participating students. And then measure 4, the average daily attendance of participating students and the average daily attendance of all students in the comparison group, whether that's the rest of the school, the rest of the district, the rest of the tribe, etc. Next slide. And now I'm going to keep us moving, Sarah, and we're going to go to selection criteria, and I'll turn it back over to Donna.
Great, thank you, Angela. So this next section will actually be talking about the selection criteria to which you will be writing to in your application. And there are a total of 5 criterion, and that criteria totals 100 points, keeping in mind that there are several sub-criteria under each one of these. So we'll go through each one. Next slide. This slide is basically a courtesy and advisory only. When we have our peer reviewers who are selected to review your applications, and they take the sub-criteria and criteria and they score them, this is how we suggest they consider maybe some general ranges of how to award points. So for example, if you have a sub-criteria worth 6 points, then we say, okay, a low scoring would mean between 0 and 2, medium 3 to 4, and a high scoring would be up to 6 to 7. Oh, I'm sorry, I was reading the wrong side. Up to 5 to 6 for a high, 3 to 4 for a medium, and 0 to 2 for a low. So this is just advisory only. This is just to give you a courtesy of how the peer reviewers see and look to approach the scoring, the criteria that you submit. Next slide. Okay, so the first one of quality of project design. Now there again will be 2 different slate memos, which one will be addressing the grantees selected for absolute priority 1 and another one for absolute priority 2. And looking at the project design, just a couple of points, pointers. If you look under each sub-criteria, you can see the number of points for that section. And so just for example, let me take number 1, the extent to which the goals, objectives, and outcomes to be achieved by the proposed project are clearly specified and measurable. Many of us have heard of SMART goals. You want to make it easy for your reader to find these and to see these, making sure that it's clear, they're measurable, so you're not leaving the reader wondering, what are they really asking for? What are they trying to get here? A very important piece of your project is, of course, how you will meet and what goals you have set. We're looking at the progress towards grade level and appropriate fluency. We're looking at how your proposed project will incorporate your parent engagement, be clear of, and please address every piece of sub-criteria too. Let me emphasize that. You don't want to skip and say, oh, I'll do, do 1 and 3 and 4. You're expected to answer all of them, of course, for the full points. You're also looking at the quality of the approach for developing and administrating that pre and post assessment that we talked about. And of course, the extent to which the performance feedback and continuous improvement and how integral are to the design of your project is indicated in your application. Next slide. For this one, our quality of project services, 29 points, and you will be able to look through and look back in the NIA and this presentation to clearly see all the different sub-criteria. So I won't go through them all, but taking a look at some of these 11 points, please make sure to get the extent, read these carefully. Look at the professional development requirement. How are you intending to provide that? What's the expectation, the services for the proposed project, how are you collaborating with the appropriate partners, the extent to which the percentage of the school day that will be included in this instruction piece is indicated clearly to your peer reviewer. Make it easy for them to know, to acknowledge and see. Next slide. Looking at personnel, of course, we've talked a little bit about this, from persons who are members of the groups that have been traditionally underrepresented based on race, color, national origin, gender, age, and disability. Which teachers of that chosen language you'll be looking at to provide are identified as staff for this project? Are they well qualified? What are their relevant teaching experience of all the key personnel somebody who is going to manage the grant should have some kind of experience working with the tribe, grants management, Native American language learning, anything like that you want to obviously portray in your resumes and demonstrated in this section. Next slide. The adequacy of your resources. And there are only 2 here, but they're big. The costs are reasonable in relation to your objectives, your design, and the significance. So you really want to take that budget and make sure it aligns with your goals and objectives and are clearly delineated in your in this piece and in your budget narrative as well. And you also want to look for continued support of the project. So sustainability, how are you looking to sustain the project after the grant funding is over? That's a nice piece to highlight too. Next slide. Quality of the management plan. How do you plan to achieve these objectives of the project? Are you going to do it on time? Are you going to stay within budget? Clearly defined responsibilities and timelines and milestones throughout your project are very important. And the extent to which the time commitments of the project director are appropriate. You can have a project director and you can have a principal investigator, you can have a project coordinator and all your key personnel, but do they have the appropriate amount of commitments for this position that they intend to hold? Are they adequate? Next slide. I kind of ran through those quickly, but I know, again, you can look at the NIA and read these tiny words at a later time just to get a little bit more information. You can always follow up with questions if you have them later. Angela, next.
Thanks, Donna. As I continue to speed down this quick route here, let's go to the next slide. And actually, let's skip this slide because I'm going to come back to that in subsequent slides. We're going to talk a little bit here more about the budget information and guidance as you think about developing the budgets for your respective applications. I'm jumping to part 5, which is the budget narrative. One, because it's really where, the rubber meets the road. You're completing an itemized budget breakdown and narrative for each year of the proposed project, again, up to 60 months. And that is different from prior years where this program has only offered 3 years prior. So this is now not 36, but 60 months. Review and edit that budget narrative to ensure the total funding listed each year in your budget narrative matches the amounts that you have to enter into the standard Ed Form 524, and that's the budget form I just skipped, but we're going to come back to. Very critical to make sure that you don't have discrepancies, which could ultimately lead to budget reductions that you didn't intend if your numbers don't match. So make sure you're checking across your application. Next slide. Indirect cost information. I'm just going to say very briefly that here I'm going to ask Sarah if you can just post the link to our FAQs around indirect costs for the department. We ask that applicants please indicate your approved indirect cost rate in the Ed 524 form, but also provide your approved indirect cost rate agreement with the cognizant federal agency. That's critical to ensure that you have timely receipt and can be approved for use of those indirect cost funds if you are applying for them. And if you do not have an indirect cost rate, if you go to that FAQ page, that can help you with the process for obtaining one, or where to go, give you information on where to go for that. Next slide, please. So yes, this program, like many other discretionary programs, has an administrative cost limitation. This means that no more than 5% of funds awarded for a grant under this program may be used for administrative purposes. And for grants made using this year's funds, 22 funds, it applies only to direct administrative costs, not indirect costs. So I'm going to say 2 things about this. 5% of the total award. So somebody asked earlier, that 350,000 average award that Donna talked about, is that for each year or is that for the total grant? 350 is our guesstimated average for an annual sum for each year, meaning that if you had 300,000 across 5 years, that's 1.5 million for the total award. So when we talk about a 5% cap, we're talking on 5% of 1.5 million, okay, across the entire grant, just to be clear. Next slide, please. And I'm going to have us jump to the chart on that 2 slides forward. Yeah, thank you. Those 2 prior slides, if you look at the slide deck later, you access it, it just gives you some more examples, but I want to just kind of concentrate here on just specific cost types and examples. So if you're not familiar with this term, this admin cap, as we call it, it's really just distinguishing types of costs. So when we say administrative costs, it's costs that you use when you're actually, managing the grant or complying with our requirements. So in this chart, you see just some very concrete, simple examples. The time that a project director might take to complete personnel evaluations, that's a management function. That's a direct administrative cost. However, the project director might also turn around, right? As many of us wear many hats, also be a program person, and they are delivering the professional development activity on the native language in question to their teachers, to the staff. And so that is a program cost. Again, cost for renting community space because they're going to have an elder and student event. That's a direct administrative cost. Financial accounting activities might be an indirect cost. And then briefly, the time that the project director takes to develop, draft, and complete an annual performance report for us, for the department, or other program requirement, other forms, if we had required a federal financial form, etc. That time and effort, that FTE is a direct administrative cost. So it's pretty common for a lot of our grantees to have people who have kind of split time with program functions as well as administrative functions. So that's up to you to keep track of those distinctions. But again, that 5% is that limitation on there. Next slide, please. Donna, I'm going to turn it back to you for a quick start on the application instructions.
Okay. Thank you, Angela. All right, looking at these next applications, taking a look at the checklist, some tips, grants.gov. Next slide, please. All righty, so hopefully you've been able to access grants.gov and take a look at this application package. If you have not yet done that, you may go to www.grants.gov and input the highlighted grant opportunity number to search easily to find it. And I do want to note that the next following slides are a little bit abbreviating of what's in that application package, and it does not substitute for reading it. So again, please read it in its entirety so you can see everything you would love to know about this application process. Looking at the application checklist, we already talked a little bit about the part 6 and part 7 of the other attachments and assurances, but these are the a total of 7 parts to the application. It's an electronic application checklist, and we recommend that your application be organized in this manner. And we say that to make it easy again for the peer reviewer to follow those criteria that the selection criteria that we discussed. Instructions for all of these parts and forms are found in the application package, so you can take a look at that. When applying, here's a side note, when applying electronically via grants.gov, you will need to ensure that your UEI, it used to be DUNS number, but it is now the UEI, which is the unique entity identifier number you enter in your application, is exactly the same as the number your organization used when it registered with the System for Management Award, or otherwise known as SAM. So make sure that unique entity identifier is the same. Next slide.
Donna, can I add one thing about the UEI number real quick? Two issues that applicants should be aware of. The first is just a very critical reminder that applying for a UEI on sam.gov, as Donna just directed, is a free process. You should not be paying anybody to do that for you. There's no need to do a for-fee support. That is something you should be able to do for free using sam.gov. The second issue is if by chance you are an applicant that is applying for the first time or just renewing your UEI on your registration and getting a UEI on sam.gov, and you just started that process, let us know. Send an email to nal@ed.gov. And if you need help making sure that you can expedite it in time to submit the application, we want to make sure that you have that. So if you run into any issues or you're in the middle of that registration process, please, again, let us know at nal@ed.gov. Thank you. Sorry, Donna.
No, thanks. I'm glad you brought that up. Looking at part 1, preliminary documents, these are forms or standard forms that you see in most of the Department of Ed discretionary grant applications, and they include forms SF424. A couple of tips we want to bring to your attention and refer to the instructions again in the application package for guidance. And be sure when you look at the SF424 question 8F to provide the correct, complete contact information for the individual who can answer questions regarding our application. There may be times where we need clarifying call to be made regarding finding something out that wasn't clear that we needed to follow up, and it's not good to be not know exactly where to go or get an out of office or something. So please make sure the contact information is complete and current, and that you also select the correct entity type. And this can be done through the drop-down list, as you will see. Next slide.
Thanks, Donna. I'll take this.
Yep.
Just a reminder, I was talking about the budget narrative earlier and the itemization. When we say make sure it matches the numbers elsewhere in your application, this is what it should be matching. Similarly, there's a question on this form that asks about indirect cost rate. Make sure you enter that indirect cost rate, but also provide your approved indirect cost rate agreement, your valid indirect cost rate agreement. Next slide. A general rule of thumb about allowable costs is to make sure you're consulting uniform guidance and applicable regulations. One just common question that we get with this work is supplies versus equipment. So, you know, we know that your definitions for your entities might not match what the federal government is. So the federal definition for supply is all tangible personal property other than those described in the definition of equipment. So a computing device, i.e. computers, probably a printer, is a supply acquisition so long as it's less than the lesser of the capitalization level established by non-federal entity. For your purposes, know if it's $5,000 or less per unit, it's a supply. So really, we don't expect that we would be seeing equipment for the most part. I can't think of an example, frankly, under this program, but most items would count as supplies, even if it is, for example, iPads for a particular class for native language instruction, etc. But you want to list that per unit cost that you anticipate. Next slide. Donna?
Yes, that's me. Thank you, Angela. Part 3 is the abstract. In the application instructions, it tells you really don't want you to exceed 2 double-spaced pages of the abstraction. You should be, again, identifying very clearly which absolute priority you are seeking to fund an application for. Make sure you're including your consortium members, if applicable, the partners, the project title, eligibility, the native language. All these pieces here need to be somehow captured within that abstract. That abstract piece is very important for if you are funded, that information is posted for everyone to see on our web pages. And a lot of people do refer back to these to see what programs we fund. And the application information in the abstract should be very clear and easy to obtain. Next slide. Here we look at recommending a 30-page limit. We recommend using some of the standards here. I'll let you take a look at that. It's easily followed. You can look at it a little bit more in detail, but making sure that you understand that an application will not be disqualified if it exceeds the recommended page limit. So if you happen to go over, don't worry, it doesn't mean you're going to be thrown out, but we do recommend these. Next slide. And the budget narrative, you saw the 524 form earlier, and that's highlighting and showing how your funds will be allocated to the forgot the word, never mind, the budget narrative, and looking at how and explaining how we talked earlier about how your funds will match your goals and objectives. And this is the opportunity to say, okay, we're going to have this much money and it's going to fund this, and this is how we're going to do that. So make sure that these funds, and they're highlighted in yellow here, the three, somebody said the three stooges, but let's say the three amigos, allocable, allowable, and they are reasonable. Because if your grant is selected, your application is selected for funding, your program officer to be will be looking through your budget and going through and looking for these things. And an applicant should provide sufficient detail to enable reviewers and project staff to understand exactly how your requested funds will be used and how much will be expended, and the relationship between the requested funds, again, and activities and outcomes. So if you put a bulk number of 50,000 for supplies, that's not very informative, right? So you want to break it down in your narrative to explain to that program officer how you are intending to spend that $50,000. And your uniform guidance to help you for cost principles, we've given you a nice little link that you can go to check for these allocability and allowability and reasonable costs. Next slide. We've already talked a lot about the other application piece and shared lots of what's needed. This specific form is required for all applications, so please answer each question that it needs to be completed. Next slide. We've already talked a lot about this, so I'm going to skip this slide and turn it to Angela.
Thank you, Donna. Brenna, thank you for your question on indirect cost rate. I know that our TA staff is going to post another email that you're going to be able to send questions to regarding IDC rate and how you would break that down, okay? So I'm just noting that for anybody else that might have critical questions around indirect cost rate and versus admin cap questions. So I want to shift gears a little bit and come back to, you know, again, where the rubber hits the road, and talk about just the nitty gritty, tangible, what documents do I need, right? So as we talk about what documents you need, part of it, again, depends on what kind of entity you are. So you're going to see, I'm going to be talking over the next few slides around tribal entities versus non-tribal, and you see who those are there, and you probably know which one you are. We know that this will be challenging. It's very quick that we're going to go through this, but if you have questions, I would definitely come back to this slide deck that will be posted by Friday, I believe, Sarah, on our program page, on our applicant page for NAL ED. Let's go to the next slide and get us started. So first, we're talking about what kind of documentation might be required of a federally recognized tribe that is, again, applying as the lead applicant. Earlier, Donna talked about Part 6, and there are some standard forms in there. One of the standard forms is that general application requirement, which is required of all applicants. And that attachment and corresponding assurances are provided. We keep referring to what we call the application package, and you've seen that in our slide deck. Understand that when you go to grants.gov and you actually go into the section where this application is, where all the forms are, you'll see blue URL, web links to all of the standard forms, but then you see a radio button that says applicant instructions. And it's that button that you press to get what we're calling this application instructions package. And that has all of the details and these standard forms that are going to be required of you for all applicants. Again, this general application requirement attachment. It is to be signed and dated by the authorizing representative of the tribe. So that would be whatever tribal official can sign off on checks and all that good stuff, same person. A memorandum of agreement. If the tribe so chooses to have a partner, for example, an LEA, a local educational agency or school district, then that memorandum of agreement, that consortium agreement, I'm using those terms interchangeably, can be signed and dated by the authorizing representative of that partner entity, in this case, that district. And that's usually who it is. It's usually at the district level. It's usually that district superintendent or corresponding assistant soup. For a BIE funded school, that might be a tribally controlled school or a BIE operated school. Again, in those cases, it might be at the school level, or it might be a TEA, depending again, a tribal education agency that's signing on behalf as an authorizing representative. And then for number 3, you see this is optional, right? So this is going back to that competitive preference priority. However, if you're a tribal entity, I don't know why you would not want to procure free points, right? So competitive preference priority, this is this is the Title VI funding. So again, if you are a tribe or a tribal organization or BIE operated, and you are in partnership with an entity that receives Title VI funds, then you again are providing that form that we provide in the application package. Is a standard form in there. It does not require a signature. However, the participating district or school is going to probably need to be the one to complete it because of the nature of the information being asked specific to their grant. So again, that CPP1 Title VI funding priority to be considered as a tribal lead applicant. If you're doing this in partnership with an entity that's receiving these funds, they don't need to sign that form, but they are probably going to need to give you information that you'll need to complete it. And it must be complete. These forms must be complete, or they are not complete. All right, let's go to the next slide. Documentation required of a tribal college or university. Similar, right? You're going to see the same things again. General application requirement, MOA, if presumably you're partnering with a K-12, school, whether it's a BIE funded school or a public school. Competitive preference priority 1, again, Title VI funding. TCUs typically are not those entities receiving them, meaning they've got to do that in partnership with the school or schools or district that are receiving those funds. Same thing as the tribe, where you're going to need to have that form completed, not signed, but completed. Next slide, please. Again, documentation required of a TEA. General app, MOA, again, if a partner is involved, and it's to be signed and dated by the authorizing representative of each partner entity. Want to go back and remind you of something Donna shared, which was make sure you're not submitting a consortium agreement or memorandum of understanding or agreement that was created 5 years ago and that has older dates. It has to be dates within the last 4 months of the deadline of this application, so not farther back than she described earlier. And then again, if you decide to pursue competitive preference priority 1 points, you must have that form completed with the support probably of the school or schools or district that you're working with. Next slide. Yet again, that look familiar? Again, tribal entities, same things. Okay, I won't repeat myself there. It's the same type of information. Next slide. Now we're talking about documentation required of a private, tribal, or Alaska Native nonprofit organization. Again, same things. General application, MOA if a partner is involved, likely the case. Competitive preference, priority 1, Title VI funding. And again, those first two must be signed and dated by the corresponding authorized representatives. And the last item does not need a signature, but again, you'll need school support or district support to complete it. Next slide. All right, now here comes the fun part. If you are non-tribal, if you're a non-tribal for-profit lead entity, meaning if you're the lead applicant, here are the documents that you're going to need. You're going to need the general application requirement attachment, which is required of everybody. You will need the MOA, probably, if you're a partner, if you'll likely have partners, and again, signed and dated by all corresponding authorized reps. Third, you'll need a copy. This is different from the others in that you'll need a copy of applicant engagement with tribal officials. When we say applicant generated, you're creating that. So it might be a letter of support or other comparable evidence like an agenda from a meeting of tribal consultation with the partner tribe or tribes, depending on where you are and who you're proposing to serve. Tribal certification, number 4. That is a standard form provided in that application instructions package. That must be signed and dated by a tribal official, and that form must be complete. Again, correspondingly, if you choose to pursue additional points under the competitive preference priorities, number 5 is optional, does not need to be signed, but needs to be completed probably with the help of your school or district partner. And competitive preference priority 2 is about Indian preference. So remember, if you had a consortium agreement or have a consortium agreement as part of this application, and it includes a tribal, a federally recognized tribe, tribal organization, TCU or BIE funded school, then you can include this and indicate that you're asking for it to be considered for Indian preference because they're part of your consortium application. Okay, next slide. And documentation required of a school operated by the Bureau of Indian Education. So again, needs a little more than some of the tribal entities, but needs the general application requirement attachment and assurances like everybody else. If you have a partner, then an MOA. If you should have something, again, you'll need an applicant engagement with tribal officials, a letter of support from the corresponding tribe or tribes. Tribal certification, you will need tribal certification, so signed and dated by a tribal official. And then again, similar to others, if you choose to pursue competitive preference priority points, then you're looking to include the form for CPP1 in that package that needs to be filled out either if it's your funding, Title VI funding, or if it's another school's funding or district's funding that you are partnering with. Competitive preference priority 2, Indian preference, again, generated by you. This might be the MOA if you have an MOA with the corresponding partner or partner tribes, tribe or tribes rather. And again, if you choose a letter of support, just acknowledging their partnership. Next slide, please. All right, and if you are a local educational agency, school district, including a public charter school, that is an LEA under state law. Again, all the goodies included: general application requirements, MOA if you have a partner, applicant engagement with tribal officials is a must, tribal certification, again, the forms provided in the application package, and that must be signed. You must get that signed. Competitive preference priority 1 and 2, same documentation for each correspondingly. The forms in the package for CPP 1, and you generate that CPP 2 Indian preference if you have an MOA, consortium agreement, memorandum of agreement with a tribal entity. So again, lots depending on who you are. Next slide. I'll say one other key piece, which is people asked earlier about where can we put other relevant information, like copy of the IDC rate agreement, individual resumes. So when you speak to the management plan, and especially for those folks that are, for example, applying under absolute priority 1, it's a new program. It's likely that you don't have all of the players in place already. In lieu of an actual resume, you can be including, for example, a job description that indicates what kind of levels of qualification, skills, etc., that you would expect that individual to have once hired or once you did get funds. Next slide, please. We mentioned this already, just coming back to this is where you're adding any information about CPP2. And then let's go to number 7, or next slide rather, part 7. And again, this is more of those standard forms. Those are the standard forms that you see in grants.gov. They have their own corresponding instructions on how to fill them out, if you have to fill them out, etc. And I'm going to jump to the next slide. And Donna, if you want to just give some quick takeaways there.
Sure. Thank you, Angela. So just a couple of quick tips for application submission instructions. Remember, all applications must be submitted electronically through grants.gov. There is a plethora of information on grants.gov site for potential grantees, applicants, and everything you want to know about submitting anything and everything to grants.gov. So please go to that site. Again, a couple of reminders: do not upload any password protected files to your application. Register early. It does take time to get some of these UEIs, and it does take time to upload applications to grants.gov, especially if you're competing with other application deadlines. It has to be submitted by the deadline by 11:59 p.m. and 59 seconds, or else grant.gov, it shuts down. There is absolutely no way to accept it after that point. So that is a very hard deadline. Next slide. I will be the competition manager for this program. So if you have grants.gov submissions, don't send it to me if you have problems. Grants.gov will help you. We have phone, email, website, everything you could possibly need to have if you need technical assistance with grants.gov. Okay, next slide. Angela.
You can read the slide. I'll underscore read, and proofread. Next slide. Again, justifying your activities, explaining the rationale, following those selection criteria, and completely addressing the selection criteria, making sure that budget you're proposing aligns is critical. Next slide. Turn it back to you, Donna.
Okay, and this last section of this is just a little bit, kind of a preview of what happens when we do eligibility screening. Applications will be screened once we get them all in after the deadline. We immediately start screening them, and we'll look at ineligibilities. You will be sent by email. All eligible applications will be reviewed by the peer reviewers. And next slide. Then they will be independently read and scored by 3 peer reviewers. Panel monitor will handle a panel discussion and facilitate a discussion on your application, and a compressed review window help the reviewers with clear applications. This is just kind of a snapshot of that process of once that deadline has passed. Next slide, Angela.
Let's keep going. I think we've already shared this. Sarah, if you want to mention briefly here, and I'll hit the next slide or the last slide. Again, notices of intent to apply and application questions can be sent to nal@ed.gov. We once again have the link on the screen, and thank you, Sarah. You have provided an end of event poll, and I'll let you speak to that.
So if you don't mind taking one final poll for us today, it will take you approximately 1.5 minutes. It should have popped up on your screen, and it's just a quick way for us to get feedback about how useful this particular webinar was for you as we then plan for future events. So if you don't mind taking just 90-ish seconds to take that for us, we appreciate it. And then I'll pop over in the chat box that email address where you can send your notice of intent to apply and any further application questions.
Thank you, Sarah. I think with that, I'll stay on if I see any other burning questions. Otherwise, I think folks know where they need to go. Brenna, I'll just say we get a lot of questions about scope and scale, and I can't speak to that. It'll be really an issue just dependent on the applicant pool and how peer reviewers will look at that.
And I've also again posted a link to the OIE NAL ED website, which is where we'll be posting up both the recording of this webinar as well as the first webinar. Just to forewarn, they are exactly the same, so you don't have to watch both, exactly the same, as well as we'll be posting up the slide deck.
And what is our deadline again?
I'm checking the chat box to see if anybody has it.
Your exit interview.
There we go. People have it. August 2nd. And just a
I can't
reminder
give
that
you extra
that
points for
deadline
that,
is
Lindsay and
Eastern
Mariah.
time. There's always questions about that. So it's Eastern time, 11:59 Eastern.
Yes.
Washington, D.C. time, 11:59 p.m. and you submitted at 12:01 and we won't be able to accept it. So just be sure.
Well in advance.
Yeah.
Start early as possible.
Joys of technology, submit early.
Mhm.
Okay. All the best to you all. Good
Yes.
luck.
Good luck.